What's going on, fellas? I have been asked to participate in a little video response by none other than Paris, Mr. Bald Omni-Man. Paris shot me a text a day or two ago saying that he was going to make this video, kind of giving me a heads up if I wanted to start planning out my response. And he gave me the general prompt of the video is, if you were going to speed run your current physique using just like 10 exercises, what 10 exercises would you select? I was like, oh, that's a really cool prompt. That's a cool list. You know, it's a little bit more interesting and it lends itself to a little bit more storytelling than your average, my top 5 exercises with no kind of qualification on top of that. So I was, oh, that's cool. I thought about it for a little bit and I thought, you know, I should probably do mine if I were going to speed run my current strength, because to me, my physique is a byproduct of my strength. I don't bench press to have big pecs. I have big pecs because I train the bench press often. I don't squat to have big legs. I have big legs because I squat for volume to try to improve my work capacity and try to improve my leg strength. And the size of my legs is a means to an end. And I've always thought that's kind of cool. You know, I've always wanted to look strong. You know, I'm not above caring about how I look, but I always thought, I'm like, it's cool that my legs are big as a symptom of what I'm really trying to do, which is have strong legs. You know, I don't care that my physique isn't perfect. I used to get these comments. People really thought my channel was like a bodybuilding channel of sorts, because people were like, oh man, you're looking great, bro, but you really got to work on your biceps more to even out your physique. And I'm like, I'm not super concerned with evening out my physique. My triceps are a lot bigger than my biceps because I think they're a lot more relevant to a lot more tasks, so I train them more. But, you know, I want to look like a strong guy, and that's always been one of my goals. But I thought, you know, it's always been a byproduct. That's always been my thought process. It's like, yeah, I would be upset if I was super strong and didn't look super strong. So I was like, you know, I'll do a top 10, like if I were to speed run my current strength, what would be like the nuts and bolts that I would implement? And I started planning it out and I started writing down on a notepad. I'm like, okay, you know, I'm going to do this, 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 this. And I looked at it and I was like, ah, shit. This is going to be the most boring video ever. Everyone's going to fucking hate this. Dude, no one is going to like this because it's the most cornbread, like white bread, basic ass, like Cheerios without the honey kind of list. What every fitness program is made of. It's just the basics. I'm going to tell you, oh, if I were to speed run my current strength, I would bench press, I would overhead press, I would like do pull-ups, I would do barbell rows, I would do deadlifts from the floor, I would do squats, I would do glute ham raises, and it's going to be the most boring basics because that is the fundamentals to me. And my approach to getting strong has always been nailing the execution, individualizing the fundamentals to how I need to do them, but mastering them and applying these basics in the right quantities. I always viewed it like my diet, right? I don't have to do anything fancy. If I'm eating the right quantities of veggies, beef, and rice, I'm going to get great results. And it's more about focusing on modulating the right amounts and doing the exercises right than it is doing anything all that fancy. So I was like, this is going to be a boring video. People are going to hate it if I tune in. It's just like, let me tell you, boys, pull-ups and barbell rows build your back. Bench press and dips build your chest and triceps, right? Like, it's going to suck. So I thought about it for a bit and I came up with an alternate idea. We're going to walk through what it was that I did. We're going to go back to the physique side because the strength training stuff, I could do this another time and do the equivalent video for strength. But I'm going to walk through what it was that I did that finally grew whatever muscle. Because I started out a very skinny lad with pretty minimal muscle. I looked pretty in shape from boxing, but I would not say I had any muscle mass anywhere. I don't think any muscle really jumped out as developed. And through my training, it wasn't until I implemented certain exercises or certain practices that certain things really started to visibly develop. Now, I could absolutely make this video for strength as well. You know, I didn't have strong quads until I started doing this. I didn't have a strong posterior chain until I started doing this. But we're going to follow the spirit of Paris's video, and we're going to give you kind of the progression of my physical development from a skinny young lad to a larger lad. So I've got a list here to make sure I don't forget any. When I started lifting, I got pretty into strength training right away. It wasn't necessarily really about bodybuilding. I just saw that there were numbers associated with lifting, and I was like, I want bigger numbers than everybody at this YMCA. And I had a propensity toward it. It really took off right off the bat. And one of the first muscles that grew on me was my spinal erectors and traps. Just because I heard deadlifts were a hardcore exercise and picking up heavy weight off the floor sounded like the gist of strength training to me. So I started with horrible form, picking up a ton of weight off the floor. Because I wasn't effectively hip hinging, no one ever taught me to hip hinge. I was teaching myself to lift. My spinal erectors blew up. You know, I just went to having these ropes down the end, like my relatively skinny back with just these big spinal erectors and these big traps from locking out my shitty pole. And just picking up heavy weight from the floor week after week after week, building up the capacity to do so and recover quicker, and eventually picking up heavy weight off the floor twice a week, week after week after week. I did it badly. There was some small back tweaks in there, but that was what really built up my spinal erectors, my traps, right off the bat. Then the next muscle, like I was like still a skinny guy with these big spinal erectors. And then the next muscle that really started visibly growing on me was my quads. And part of that is absolutely genetic, but part of that was because what I was listening to was, you got to do the hardcore exercises, this bread and butter, this meat and potatoes shit, and fuck all this fluffy stuff. Back then, there was this idea that compounds were going to inherently build more muscle than isolation lifts, that they were just automatically more disruptive to homeostasis, and that meant automatically you're going to get more hypertrophy from it. Lots of people are now pushing back on this, saying, hey, where is the proof of this? Wouldn't being able to localize your fatigue to the muscle a little bit better maybe give you better results? Maybe the fact that we're not limited by our lower back, maybe the fact that we're not limited by our balance and our peripheral fatigue might make this a more pungent, hypertrophy stimulus, right? And lots of guys are going in that other direction where how can we localize the stimulus rather than use these more global stimulus of these big compounds? But that was the narrative at the time, and I bought into it. It was like, big exercises build big muscles. That makes sense to me. You're never going to get big muscles doing small exercises. And looking back, I'm glad I bought into this philosophy because from a strength training perspective, I think that more global stimuli and learning to move your body through space, like, yeah, you could make an argument that a barbell row bent over is not the best upper back stimulus because you have this propensity to be limited by your lower back. But the fact that it's working the lower back is great GPP for your deadlift. It forces you to get more comfortable in this bent over position. If you go to do your barbell rows and your back is sore from deadlifting, you're going to have to learn to fucking brace. You're going to get more comfortable in these positions. And I find that, these more holistic exercises, while they're not inherently better for hypertrophy, set me up really well for having a great base for strength training. So I'm kind of glad I bought into this idea that compounds are everything and isos are shit. Because I was told, you want big legs, go fucking squat. Squat twice a week for lots of volume, and that's what I did. I kind of learned that, okay, I needed to do a deep squat. I'm not trying to do a wide stance, west side style squat. I want to work my quads. So a moderate stance squat, reasonably deep, the knees go over the toes. I need to do whatever stretching is necessary to facilitate this position and to have a decent looking squat. And then I'm going to go put in a bunch of sets of 8. 2 times a week, once with a pause, once without a pause. And I just started plugging away, and I did these brutal workouts, and it wasn't just the squatting, but I really attribute a lot of that progression to the squatting, where I would do all these sets of 8 and 10 on my squat. For a while I did 10 by 10 squats, 10 by 10 leg press, and then 5 by 10 leg extension and leg curl. And then I would go out into the parking lot of the YMCA, and I would walking lunge as far as I could for like 10 minutes straight. And every single Wednesday before school, I would wake up early. I would walk to the gym like a couple of miles. So I'd get up super early. I'd eat my breakfast. I'd walk to the gym, and I would puke my guts out in the parking lot of the YMCA doing this German volume training, because at the time, that's what I thought all the big guys were doing. And I was like, well, if you work harder, your muscles are going to get bigger. And I would then be like, oh shit, I lost my breakfast. So I'd eat an extra meal during the day, and I would be drinking my protein shakes in class. And I would be like cracking open a can of tuna to eat between classes, because I was like, this is what everybody does. It was only later that I realized that probably wasn't the most intelligent training plan, but I will tell you, my legs just got thicker every week. Every time I would puke in this parking lot and then go replace all that food, eat as much as I could, I would do all this volume on a deep fucking squat. Just go squat. And that's what I was always told by the big guys, was just like, oh, all these other exercises are for pussies. Just squat. Leg training is you fucking squat and you pick up heavy weights off the floor, and that's your lower body training. And I'm kind of glad I learned this, because it's been a great foundation for my strength training. And I think it's made me, if nothing else, pretty tough within my training. I like it. I think leg training is you go squat, you pick some heavy shit up off the floor, and then you do your accessories. And my legs really thickened up. They responded great to this. I would just destroy my legs in the gym. I would understand that your legs are a big muscle. So I just created this big deficit, this big demand. And I would just eat as much as I could. I would force feed like 5 times that day, because I didn't want that disgustingly hard leg workout to go to waste. And my legs grew like weeds. Okay, gotta go quicker. My phone is gonna die. That would be quite awkward. So yeah, so the first muscle I grew was my erectors, just from this idea of picking heavy stuff off the floor. And then my legs really thickened from hammering these deep squats for volume twice a week and just building up the work capacity. Obviously, we wanna build into this in a way to not hurt ourselves. I'm a little smarter now. We wanna make sure our mechanics are sound. We wanna develop that work capacity over time rather than just throwing ourselves into the deep end. But getting used to being able to squat for volume deep twice a week will grow your legs. And if I were to speed run growing my legs again, I'd probably do something similar. Same thing, if I wanted big erectors, I'd pick stuff up. I'd train my ability to pick stuff heavy up off the floor. Maybe we pick up light stuff off the floor once a week, and then medium stuff, and then heavy stuff. And then we do one day of heavy stuff off the floor and one day of really light stuff off the floor. We build into the two. And it's taken me a long time to do that. But your ability to have a given frequency is a trainable quantity. I always used to think, oh, well, what's the perfect frequency for me? I've got a long torso and short arms. I'll only deadlift once a week. And it was only really I realized you can train yourself into just about any frequency you can imagine. The question is, should you? Should you train your ability to bench 3 days a week? Probably. Should you train your ability to do 2-a-days and bench 7 times a week, twice a day? Probably not. It probably wouldn't yield a good result, but you could probably do it. You can build into all of these things as your body's remarkably adaptable. And I should have realized quicker that I could build into that twice a week. I was a weird looking little fella. I had these big spinal erectors and these big legs, but skinny little noodle arms. My shoulders were small. Nothing about me was all that impressive, but I was already benching a lot of weight just because it kind of came naturally to me. And then I figured out that I should probably be pausing my benches. And when I started pausing every rep on the bench press I did, every rep on the dumbbells, every rep on the incline, my chest exploded. I just got pecs out of nowhere. From a relatively flat chest that you'd never call someone with pecs to just having them. My bench got even bigger very quickly. And the other thing I understood about this time was I would do some volume and then I would push up heavy and I'd be like, okay, well, if I go heavy again next week, maybe I could squeak out 5 more pounds. And then if I go heavy again next week, maybe I could squeak out 5, but I'm kind of running out. What do? I need to drop back. And I did some research to what the good lifters of the past and the good lifters I could find, what they were doing. Like, okay, well, how far do I've used this analogy of a battering ram many times. To get the momentum to break through a new PR, we need to draw that backwards. We can't just keep it pinned up at the door and press on it. We're not going to get sufficient momentum to go through the door. So how far do I have to bring this back? And I kind of got the general rule of thumb of drawing back to about 60% and then building my way back up and crushing through the PR. And I don't need to be constantly touching that 90% plus to confirm it's still there. It'll be there when I get to the end of the training cycle. And I'm wasting time that I could be building that momentum into the door by tapping the door to see if it's moved yet. You know what I mean? So I kind of understood that alongside this pausing the bench and this idea of, okay, once I've kind of topped out my potential of what I can do with this base, I need to draw back to 60% and spend however many weeks building back into it. And I paused all my bench volume and my pecs blew up. Still, I'm a weird looking guy. Now I've got these big pecs, but I'm very narrow. I've got these small arms. I've got these big legs. I've got these big spinal erectors. A little bit more of like a power lifter type physique at this point because I'm like, okay, well, I've kind of reaped the benefits of benching for me. I've reaped the benefits of squatting and deadlifting. And it doesn't lead to a very well-rounded physique. The next thing I did was in my efforts to get a big bench because I saw, wow, I'm pretty good at this one. I'm already benching more than like most of these grown men at the YMCA. I'm going to research this. And I read everything I could. I watched every video I could. And I noticed that even though it was a little bit of a relic of equipped lifting, this obsession with the triceps, every good bencher I could find kind of advocated for the isolation of the triceps after you finish your bench volume. I said, okay. And I started hammering my triceps. I started hammering my triceps again. I built up the capacity to do so 3 times a week. Elbows became indestructible, and I would end every tricep workout with like 100 total working reps. So I built into this frequency, and I built into this crazy volume, and I would use a variety of exercises from push downs, but I think what put the most mass onto my triceps was exercises that emphasized a stretch. I used to do those dumbbell front presses until I got so strong that I could, like there wasn't a dumbbell heavy enough, and then I switched to using an easy curl bar. Using this lengthened position for the tricep, hammering a lot of volume, doing lots of dumbbell skull crushers and tricep extensions to behind the head. Again, hammering tons and tons of volume, high rep sets, like 15 to 20 rep sets with as much weight as I could possibly do for these high reps. I was obsessed with, I'm going to hit one plate on each side on the bar for these extensions for 20. And then it was like, I want to hit 185. And I just started chasing these numbers, these volume, probably to a little bit too much of a degree, but my triceps really started to thicken. So now I didn't look like I had small arms, I just had small biceps. Again, still very much in the realms of a powerlifting physique because that's all I was doing at the time. I had started doing some powerlifting meets, I'd done a meet or two, had a great time, did another meet, and that was basically the gist of my strength training. The next muscle that I kind of figured out how to develop and really started to get big was my posterior chain. And I was pulling sumo at the time, and I realized that my hip hinging function and my strength in a lengthened position of my hamstrings was pretty poor. So I started working one day of pulls from the floor, and I started working one day of volume on RDLs. And then once I got really good at the RDLs, really solid, a good technique, relatively neutral back, keeping the weight in close, keeping the hips, reaching them back, keeping the legs relatively stiff-ish. And I was doing all that work with my hamstrings. Once I kind of really mastered those, I then moved to dead stop stiff legs from the floor because Dan Green is cool and started making them a little bit more specific to a deadlift. So I'm cracking that dead stop off the floor. So a very fundamental mechanic of the deadlift. I'm getting to work that twice a week again. Like I said, I'm pulling heavy weights from the floor twice a week. Or at this point, I'm pulling heavy weights and then medium weights. And my hamstrings, in combination with doing a bunch of volume on hamstring curls, because I heard that the short head of the hamstring does not tie across the hip and won't be worked with hip hinging. And it made sense to me. And okay, I wouldn't want to neglect part of my hamstring. I need to get a complete hamstring workout. So I started going hard on my hamstring curls, just like Bald Omni Man talked about. You know, John Meadows was making videos by this point saying, you know, hamstrings are a great part of your physique and blah, blah, blah. The biggest problem is that people don't work hard on them because you can't see them and they're not this show muscle. You need to go just as hard on the hamstring curl as you would on your quad exercises or your chest exercises. So I started going really hard because I thought, okay, well, I need this well-rounded strength if I want to be all around a big, strong guy, because I had these aspirations to be really big and strong. So I was like, I can't have any gaps in my game. I can't miss this part of my hamstring. And now looking back, I think of things more in terms of functions than I do muscles. And I'm glad that I started working knee flexion as well as hip extension. And as I started hammering this volume, started hitting good numbers with good technique on these RDLs, and then eventually progressed to the stiff legs, all the while pumping up my hamstrings until I couldn't walk anymore. Afterward on the hamstring curl, my posterior chain started to fill out. I started to have a really impressive lower body. The quads were there, the adductors were there from the squatting. And then now from these RDLs and these hamstring curls, the posterior chain were there. My legs were getting huge around. Unfortunately, I was a very shy fella, so I always wore these really baggy shorts because I didn't want people to see my legs. But I had some big wheels under there. And that was kind of the next muscle that I figured out, was this use of, okay, well, one day we're going to pull from the floor, drop our hips into position, into this advantageous position. And then the other, we're going to reach our hips back. We're going to keep our legs stiffer, and we're going to really develop the low back and the hamstrings. And that really started to thicken up that part of my physique. The next thing that I think happened was I realized my real passion is strength training, not just powerlifting. I want to be a strong person all around. And that's kind of why I eventually gravitated towards strongman, is at least in theory, it's designed to be this test of overall strength. It's not just 1 rep max on 3 motions. It's 1 rep max on all motions, as well as rep strength and strength endurance and stability and your ability to move with weight and your ability to pick up a lot of weight. So it's just like, who's the best deadlifter? Well, you got to be the best deadlifter for a max, for reps, for an elevated height, for these different bars. And we're going to really just find out who's the best at deadlifting overall. And I like that idea about, okay, well, I'm trying to build my general strength, not hyper specialize into this one thing. Not to knock powerlifting. Max loves powerlifting. I love powerlifting. But that was kind of what always training was to me, was trying to become this absolute physical unit in all capacities. And I realized there was a big hole in my game. At this point, I had probably built up to about a 425-pound bench press. But I did not look like a 425-pound bench presser. I looked relatively unimpressive. I had these big pecs. If I had my shirt off, you could probably tell I was kind of strong. And I had these big wheels. I had really big legs. You know, I had these spinal erectors, but my legs were huge. My calves were not huge. And I had these spinal erectors in chest and triceps. So you're like, okay, if you know what you're looking at, you might suspect I'm kind of strong, but nobody would ever guess I was moving the kind of weights I was. And at this time, I think I went to do a overhead press max out of curiosity. And I believe I failed 2 plates because I hadn't been doing much work in the vertical plane. I had been doing lots of dips, lots of direct tricep work, lots of dumbbell bench, and all of these things were going very well, and also lots of Larson pressing to build up that 425 bench. And I realized this was a bit of a hole in my game. And I was kind of running into an issue on my bench press where if I was in the perfect groove, it would go smooth. But if I missed the groove, I would get halfway up, I couldn't grind it at all, and it would come right back down on me. And I came to the theory that it was because my shoulders were weak. I felt as though my shoulders were the part of the bench press that contributed to the horizontal travel of the bar more so than anything else. And if I was unable to push that bar back into its groove, if I deviated at all, maybe my shoulder strength was lagging a little bit. So I went to do an overhead press and I was shocked by how weak I was. And I was like, well, I'm a strong presser. I want to be a strong presser all around, not just a strong, I don't want to be the Sam who's strong at benching. I want to be a strong presser because I was like, okay, cool. I've got this monster bench. I've got this monster dips. I think by this point I was hitting like 5 plates around my waist for 4, I think by this point. So I was like, why shouldn't that apply to the vertical plane? So I was a man possessed. I started placing an equal amount of emphasis on the overhead press as I was on the bench press. And because I had this massive base of, some delt strength from the bench press, benching with a close grip, and this big base of tricep strength from obsessively training them, I got good pretty quickly. It took me 1 training cycle and I was already up in the ballpark at 275 because of this base I had as a big bench presser. And then I just kept going harder and harder and harder. And I made it to 315 and then I made it past 315. And now my best overhead press to date with a good bit of layback is 375. And I hope to beat that this year. That's one of my goals. And when I started doing this, I noticed some very visible changes. I was a very advanced lifter at this point. I wasn't used to rapid changes in my physique anymore. It was more gradual. Like, you start doing this thing, takes a couple training cycles, you start to see it. Over the course of introducing this, I finally got wider. I was a very thick front to back and not very wide guy before. And as soon as I started doing this, just this general mass around my shoulder girdle, I finally started getting wider. And my traps also grew quite a bit. And it was this big difference in my physique where now I looked like a strong guy. I didn't look like this hyper-specialized guy who was deceivingly strong. I started to look a little bit more like my actual strength level. And that big growth of my shoulder girdle was almost all from including this equal emphasis on vertical pressing as well as horizontal pressing. I would say that I made an effort, to try to maintain some semblance of structural symmetry because I did kind of know what I was doing at this point. I was like, okay, well, if I'm going to pack all this muscle onto my front delt, I should probably even that out and have developed all 3 heads of the deltoid. So I was doing some lateral raises on the side, and I wasn't going crazy hard on the lateral raises, but I was very, very keen on training my rear delt. So I started doing face pulls every time I press for 3 to 4 working sets. And then I would also do some like machine reverse pec deck kind of deal. I might do some dumbbell rear delt flies, but the biggest thing was I was always hammering my face pulls because I felt that made my shoulders more well-rounded and it made them feel very nice. So I included that alongside the overhead press, and maybe that was a part of why the shoulders got so much bigger all around and I got so much wider. But I would say a lot of it was just the overhead press. Just that heavy loading in the overhead position really changed my physique. So now, following the story till now, I had these big spinal erectors, I had big quads, I had big triceps, I had big hamstrings and glutes, and now I had these big shoulders. I was starting to be an all-around big guy who looked relatively strong. I don't know the order of these final 3. So bear with me. My memory isn't very good. I've had to really dig deep because I don't look back. I don't reflect on my training very much. I don't reflect on the journey. I'm just focused on, okay, well, how do I get ready for tomorrow's training? Max is a very reflective guy, and he can tell you what age he was when he hit every number and how his technique was. He's got a very solid storyline of his training career in his head and where he wants it to go. I have no idea where I want mine to go, and I don't know how it's gone so far. I'm just focused on eating my meals. But at some point, at this point, I had a reasonably strong midsection, but I think it was carried by having a very strong lower back. I think I compensated for maybe subpar bracing abilities, even up into these higher numbers. I was probably squatting in the high 600s at this point, deadlifting in the low to mid 7s at this point. And I think I was compensating for a poor brace mechanic and poor overall core development by having a very strong lower back. It kind of built the hell out of my lower back early in my training career. And my midsection didn't really start to develop. And my brace quality kind of developed alongside the development of my midsection. There was 2 changes I made. One of them was being a little bit less reliant on my belt. And this is something I'm hesitant to talk about on the channel because so many people are like, oh, I've got this plan. I'm going to not wear my belt until the last weekend. I'm going to put it on and I'm going to be so much stronger with it on. And lo and behold, they don't actually get much weight out of it because they're not very skilled at using it. So they need to use the belt more often to get good at it. And I don't think there's anything wrong with someone who wears their belt for the vast majority of their training. I think sometimes some people find drastic benefits from taking off their belt. I know some guys, I know some very good guys who swear by their beltless work. Eddie Hall famously said the year before he won Worlds, he just put his belt in a closet for the full year and didn't take it out until like a month out from Worlds. JF has talked about how he's a big beltless guy. So there are some very good athletes that feel it builds some physical qualities, but I also think that lower level athletes tend to misapply it pretty badly, and I think they should probably be learning to use the belt. But once we know how to use the belt and we've built up this strength, then we can start to assess. Hey, am I terrified to go above 70% without my belt? Maybe this is a deficit. Maybe this is a little safety blanket I'm using to mask a poor bracing mechanic. Or do I get nothing out of my belt? I'm bad at using my belt, right? And I was very much in this category of I knew that I needed to use my belt, and I always used it, and I got quite good at it. But I think it was masking some probably improper patterns in my bracing. So I started taking off my belt a little bit more when I was below 70, 80%, depending on the motion, but I started taking it off more. And I started being forced to be like, oh, my low back's kind of sore. I don't have my belt on to compensate. I need to do a really good job bracing so I can distribute the load. I'm not just moving it with my low back. I need to use my hamstrings and my glutes and my low back. And that kind of forced me to develop this awareness of my tightness, and I started getting tighter under the weight. And while I was doing this little beltless saga, I was also implementing a 1-to-1 abs to hinging ratio. Every working set, or even every warm-up set I would do of deadlifts or RDLs or stiff legs, I would do one set of cable crunches or planks or GHD sit-ups or hanging leg raises. Always a set. Even if it's just a warm-up, even if I just hit one plate for 5, I'll hop up on the bar and do some hanging leg raises. And when I implemented this, for me, this fixed what I perceived to be a pretty significant structural imbalance. And my midsection really started to get developed and strong. And I started feeling stable under the weights. I would say the beltless part thing was kind of specific to me, and I don't want to recommend it to you guys. But if you guys feel like you are kind of inefficient through the midsection, that 1-to-1 hinging, and maybe you could even say squatting to ab ratio was very helpful for me. I saw Brian Alsbury do it, and I was like, I'll give it a try. And it really kind of fixed another imbalance. So I'm like, okay, now I'm one more step towards being a complete developed athlete that's in proportion. You know, once I'm in proportion, I just got to keep getting stronger with everything even, not rather than being this very hodgepodge physique and strength athlete. Coming up on the last couple, my calves didn't grow. It was very annoying to me that I had these big old horse legs and tiny calves. And I tried training them, and it worked, but they didn't get big. There's a mouse in my garage. That scared me. But they didn't get big. You know, they got bigger, but they were not big like my legs. My calves did not get big until I got heavy and walked on an incline treadmill every single day. Now they're pretty big. I would say a combination of being heavy and walking a lot grew them a lot, and then also, like clockwork, doing single leg calf raises off a block, pulling myself down into the bottom position, pausing, coming all the way up, pausing, doing single leg off a block. For some reason, those in particular really helped me drive this sustainable calf progress. 2 times per week, like clockwork, just 3 sets on each session. I would say the combination of that really unlocked a new level of calf growth. And if you're trying to duplicate this and you don't want to get heavy like me, you could maybe argue that rucking might duplicate some of these more systemic effects of just walking around while heavy. You know, people talk about that with Volk, who's fighting Islam tomorrow. We'll see how that goes. About the fact that he lived life as a 200-pound man. There's some like strength that's left over from that. Even when he cut down, like his tendons and his muscles were kind of adapted to sprinting at 200 pounds. So he's a little bit more powerful because of it. I've found the same thing from just doing stuff while heavy, kind of builds this strength, and you might be able to replicate that from rucking. So that might help out your calves, and then also you could do yourself the favor of doing the single leg calf raises twice a week. Now the last muscle, it wasn't until recent that I really started to get this to grow, was my lats. You might have noticed that we're missing a big part of this physique that I wouldn't say I've got a well-rounded physique. I'm not a bodybuilder by any means, but I feel as a strength athlete, I'm pretty well-rounded. I've got the squatting, I've got the deadlifting, my vertical and horizontal pressing. Got all these kind of things kind of figured out pretty well, and I like to think that I develop them in proportion to one another rather than being a one-lift specialist, leaning into the bench press because it came easy to me. I put more effort into my other lifts because they come harder to me. You'll notice the lats is a really important muscle that I did not really start making meaningful progress on until a lot more recently than I care to admit. My lats, I was doing a lot of volume on like pull downs and chest supported rows, and it just wasn't working. I was getting these great mind muscle connection. I was doing a lot of volume, and that was kind of what I understood to be what would grow my lats. Say, okay, well, I'm directing the stimulus relatively well. I'm putting in a lot of volume, I'm getting a pump, but I don't seem to be getting this robust response. And I thought back to when I started training and what got me where I am, which is just nuts and bolts hard training. Do the hard thing. Even if there's lots of really good articulate arguments why the more directed stimulus might be a good idea, do the fucking hard thing. Pick up the weight off the floor. Put the weight on your back and squat it. Squat deep. And that was kind of the philosophy. That's why I'm the biggest JF Caron fan, because it's just matter of fact. You want big traps, put more weight on the bar. That kind of thing. Squats are just a fundamental part of life. I like that shit. I know it's a little silly. I know it's not the most nuanced take, and I know it doesn't apply to bodybuilding very well. But for what I do, I feel it applies very well. So I was like, you know what? I'm being a bitch. Why am I doing a pull down? I'm going to do a pull up with weight. And why am I doing this chest supported row? Because my back is sore, too fucking bad. Go barbell row. Go do a heavy single arm dumbbell row and post your hand if it's that bad. And suddenly, when I picked these more heavy duty motions, I got a lot bigger. Especially from doing neutral grip chin-ups, the stretch that placed on my lats, loading up a bunch of weight, putting in volume week after week after week, hammering away at it from wide grip pull-ups and the neutral. I got a lot out of the neutral. I also do neutral grip pull-downs, and that really developed my lats. I will say that. Even though I'm like pseudo anti-pull down, I love the pull down as a bench accessory, but as far as what built my back anecdotally, not that there's anything wrong with the pull down, not that it's less effective, but for me, it wasn't until I started doing the harder option. Same thing with the barbell row. I always kind of didn't do that many barbell rows because I was like, my low back's sore from deadlift. I should probably be using all of my low back recovery economy to deadlift because that's the motion I care more about. But Bromley has talked about the barbell row is light enough that really that's kind of peripheral work for your low back. That should be GPP work if we're doing it right. And I was like, my back feels like shit, but I'm gonna go do my barbell rows. And because my back felt like shit, I had to brace well. I had to do a good job or it's just gonna cramp up on me. And suddenly I'm mastering this position of being comfortable, lean forward with all this weight in my hands and keeping my back tight and also keeping that mind-muscle connection while moving these heavy weights. Because I'm a pretty big believer that most people use too much weight on their rows. As much as I'd like doing the harder option and moving some weight, doesn't mean as much weight as you can if it's at the cost of technique, right? So it's like if we go to do a high bar squat, and I'm saying, you're doing these because it's a good exercise for your quads, and you just round up your back and good morning it from this high bar position, it looks like dog shit. You can't be like, I'm hardcore because I'm going heavier. I'm gonna get bigger quads because I'm going heavier. Not really, you're not really hitting the muscle you're looking for. And this is the issue I had run into on the rows in the past, is I thought, okay, I'm gonna row heavy, I'm gonna get a big back. But I would use my very strong spinal erectors to contribute heavily to the row. And I was a relatively skinny guy, I was a strong guy, but I was a skinny guy, and I was hitting 475 on rows for sets of 6. I would say not the worst in the world, but I was using my erectors. I wasn't using my lats. I need to select a weight that I can go heavy for my lats, not heavy as I can move from A to B. So that would be a little bit of thing that I did in the past and didn't succeed with, was this like thinking I'm gonna show off with how much I row. I don't give a fuck how much I row. I wanna row heavy because I like lifting heavy, but what I care most about is the result. So I'm gonna try to make sure I'm not just like I could row 5 plates right now. I guarantee I could do some. People would be impressed by how decent looking my 5-plate rows are. Not good looking, but decent looking for a 5-plate row. And I choose not to, and it's gotten me a lot better results. But choosing the harder option unlocked a lot of strength for me and also a lot of development. And then the last one was my rear delts have always been, I think, developed enough to keep my shoulders relatively healthy from doing all my face pulls, from doing these rear delt exercises that I like. But they weren't big. They were not as big as my front delt, and they were not as big as my side delt. And they didn't really start to grow until about a training cycle or 2 ago, probably about 2 training cycles ago, where I started loading more of a cross body position and loading a stretch. We got all these studies now to maybe suggest that the most lengthened position is the most like hypertrophically stimulating, right? So a seated hamstring curl might be a little bit more hypertrophic than a lying hamstring curl because you're at a greater average muscle length. And I was like, you know what? I've always liked Powell raises, the one where you're like, imagine I'm lying sideways on a bench, I have a dumbbell up in the air, I come across my body down towards the floor, and then I come back. So it's like a rear delt fly, but we're going this extended range of motion, and we get all this resistance here, where the rear delt is a little bit more relevant. As soon as I started really just going hard on those, because traditionally Powell raises were thought of as more of like a rehab exercise, whereas rear delt flies and face pulls are more of a bodybuilding exercise, I thought, Powell raises are a pretty good exercise. Why don't I just treat these as a bodybuilding exercise? I had initially started doing them because of Shane German for like some shoulder stability work, because I think that's important for overhead. And I realized when I go hard on these, I'm like, these are a pretty good bodybuilding motion. So I started putting in hard 12s. And then I started doing some cross-body cable ones. Again, kind of the same motion as a power raise. And as soon as I started plugging in a lot of volume and busting my ass in this loaded cross-body position, suddenly my rear delt started to grow, which I didn't really expect. It was more just another way to try to keep my shoulders balanced and healthy. But they really started to visually grow. I started to like notice that it was like capping out my delts more because there was more meat on the back of my shoulder. And that was a little fun discovery recently for you more bodybuilding oriented people. That might be worth a go. But also it's great for trying to maintain your symmetry and become a well-rounded strength athlete. So that was my kind of journey of the 10 things that I did to grow muscles. This is a long ass video. I appreciate you guys for watching. Thank you to Paris for inviting me to do this.